Unlike in the 2022 season when F1 chiefs ripped up the rulebook and started again from scratch to introduce the current ground effect regulations, this year the rules are, well, at first glance anyway, relatively stable, and the cars are expected to look pretty similar to last year's challengers. But take a slightly deeper look and there are some key changes that could have a big impact in 2024. Originally, the power unit allocation for each driver was set to drop from 4 per season down to 3 for the entire year. That change has now been scrapped, but only after the manufacturers have done a huge amount of work redesigning their power units to cope with the hundreds of extra miles of racing this year. That means that all of the power units should, in theory at least, be more reliable this season. That means fewer blow-ups, fewer engine changes, and fewer grid penalties for the drivers. It's also likely to affect the performance of each power unit, which will of course affect the car's competitiveness, and could mean that the teams will be able to push their power units much harder, giving more horsepower to the drivers. Aerodynamically, the rules haven't changed much from last year, but that could mean we'll see plenty of new aero designs at testing, as the teams continue to explore the current regulations. And there's one specific area that you should keep an eye out for in Bahrain, thanks to a tiny change in the rulebook. Now, every car already has a driver cooling air intake. It's in the tip of the nose, and those holes simply funnel cool air from the front of the car into the cockpit to stop the drivers overheating.
Don't know why the cockpit was very hot.
But this year, the cars can also have an extra air scoop mounted on top of the chassis to help the drivers cope with the conditions at hotter races.
The seat is burning, mate. Anything we can do at the pistol? Throw me water or something?
Look closely in testing to see how the teams approach this, because they could resemble the McLaren F-Duct from back in 2010. We'll just have to wait and see. There's perhaps no more fundamental part to a car than its wheels, and these will be all new in 2024 as well. Japanese firm BBS, who supply all 10 teams with their wheel rims, have decided to make them a bit stronger and, in line with that, a little bit heavier to better cope with the drivers launching their cars over the curbs in search of lap time. You won't be able to see that, but another more visible change you may be able to see later in the season, depending on the results of some additional wet weather tests.
It's pretty awful. I can barely see the car in front at the minute.
In a bid to ease the visibility problems caused by spray at a wet Grand Prix, a special set of wheel arches is being designed to counter that spray effect, and they're going to be tested later this season. The hope is that they should allow racing to continue even in extreme wet weather conditions, which would otherwise cause a red flag.
And well, we had a safety car, it is now a red flag.
The push for ever greater safety means that this season the pre-season crash tests have become even more rigorous in response to Zhou Guanyu's accident at Silverstone 2 years ago.
Obviously felt quite lucky looking back to it, how the Halo was able just to help me survive on this incident.
Both the sides of the cars and the roll hoops will now have to cope with even greater forces to ensure that the drivers are as safe as possible. And that little rule tweak has had a big impact. No team can carry over last year's monocoque, the chassis, to this season, as Haas did from 2020 to 2021, for example. Those changes are simply too fundamental to the car's design. There's also a small change in the sporting regulations that could liven up races even more. From this year, the DRS, or drag reduction system, will be activated after just 1 racing lap instead of 2, which it was in the past. This means that the driver in the lead no longer has a 2-lap cushion in which to pull out a second gap ahead of the chasing pack. So we should see more overtakes in the early stages of races and after the safety car restarts. There are strict rules about what the teams can and cannot do to the cars once they're in parc fermé conditions. That is, once qualifying begins on a Grand Prix weekend. The parts and the setup of the car must remain the same from that moment on until the start of the Grand Prix. The only time major elements can be changed is if a driver's had an accident and damaged some parts that may need replacing. Up until now, any damaged part must only be replaced by one of an identical specification. Doing anything else would attract a significant penalty. But from this year, the teams will be able to use parts of a different or newer specification, but only if they can prove that they don't have any of the original parts left in the garage.
Lance Stroll finds the barrier at enormous speed to conclude Q1, And that is a heavy, heavy hit into the barrier.
A small change for this season could mean a big boost for those aspiring young racers hoping to one day grab one of the coveted 20 seats on the Formula 1 grid. From this year, the teams can run their 2022 cars outside of the normal testing limits. That's significant because it means young drivers can, for the very first time, get track time in a current generation ground effect car outside of official testing and practice sessions at Grand Prix weekends. And that should mean that if and when they do get a shot at running in FP1, they should be better equipped to make the most of that chance and potentially impress the decision makers at the teams who are weighing up who will get a race seat for next year.
And yeah, thank you for the session.
Formula 1 teams are constantly pushing the limits of design and searching for anything that will give them the edge over the competition. And there's an intriguing tweak to the technical regulations for this year that suggests that at least one team might have found a new way to gain an advantage. There are rules as to what materials the teams are allowed to use when building their cars, and that list has been slightly expanded for this year. 2 new metals have been added to the list, including an aluminium-magnesium alloy first used by NASA. So perhaps one team has found a way to make their car faster thanks to some spaceship technology.
You guys built a rocket ship of a car. Well done.